Hi, everybody again. Welcome back. It's good to be with you again today, and good to spend time thinking about our history and the things that that are distinctive to us. And this morning, we're going to continue our discussion of the American Restoration Movement, its history, looking especially today at controversies. And so I want to welcome Dr. Keith Stanglin back today to continue our discussion of the American Restoration Movement. Keith, I'll turn it over to you and let you go run with it.
All right. Thanks, Todd. It's good to be here again and be working through some of the high points of the history of the American Stone Campbell Restoration Movement. Last time when we went through this history in our last session, we talked a little bit about kind of the second generation and what I called consolidation of the movements, Barton Stone's movement and the Thomas and Alexander Campbell side of the movement, kind of in their distinctives and how they got together more or less officially in 1832. And after that, we can, as historians, speak of the Stone Campbell movement of Christians. What I'd like to do today is just think about what happened in the next generation. I don't know if we want to number these generations, but maybe it's like the third generation. After those early leaders, especially that first generation, have now died, and some of their closest associates have kind of passed from that stage of leadership after that period of consolidation. And what I'm calling this basically is controversies. Not that there weren't controversies before this, but this tends to happen with a lot of kind of revolutionary movements, both political and religious, actually, where there's a lot of energy there in the beginning about the reason for being, and they begin to form an identity, whatever group we're talking about, over against those that they're maybe breaking from. In this new identity. Those early leaders kind of articulate that vision and then begin to, in that next generation, sort of consolidate and codify that vision. And that's really the work of Alexander Campbell that we talked about last time. And then as those early leaders pass on, and people begin to expand on that vision, try to live out that vision, or maybe that original vision becomes obscured in some ways or modified along the way by new leaders, there can be controversies as the movement grows. And we see the same thing in the American Restoration Movement. So those controversies is kind of what I want to focus on today, and just what the American Restoration Movement looked like in that next stage. So Alexander Campbell died on March 4th, 1866. And as we kind of leave Campbell behind in some ways here, I want to mention and recommend a new book on Alexander Campbell. This is actually a book that comes out, I think it's scheduled for release next month, but the author was kind enough to get me an advance copy. It's A Life of Alexander Campbell, and written by Doug Foster. Scheduled to come out next month in June of 2020. Maybe it's already available. I've not read it yet. I just received it last week, but I've thumbed through the table of contents and through some particular pages, and I would say that this is going to be the standard biography of Alexander Campbell for a while, and can certainly recommend this book by Doug Foster, A Life of Alexander Campbell. So maybe just one way to set this up is to talk about sort of a sociological point that some historians have made about this development we're talking about. I've mentioned the book by Richard Hughes that I've also recommended, Reviving the Ancient Faith. It's a great book for surveying the history that we're talking about in these sessions. And one of Hugh's main claims is that the Church of Christ history can be characterized as a move from a sect to a denomination. Now, his use of these terms and this move from sect to denomination is influenced by a long history of sociological discussion of churches. Max Weber, Ernst Troeltsch, and even Richard Niebuhr talked about these terms maybe a little differently than some of us think about them. So a sect is a group that divides from the larger church. A sect sees itself as having, we might say, a monopoly on the truth, and therefore is focused on its membership as the truly elect or the truly saved. And it has an all-embracing vision, but one that is on its own terms. A sect, in this sense, is often populated by marginalized groups or people who see themselves as countercultural in a real sense. A denomination, on the other hand, is a group that we might say basically has made its peace with the surrounding culture and made its peace with other churches, that we're not so different from the other Christian believers and we have all of these things in common, okay? So you might note also just the typical life cycle of a sect to a denomination. You see it with all kinds of groups. You can see it in, I've seen it personally in interactions with Seventh-day Adventists or with Mormons, who have very distinctive and in some ways idiosyncratic views of theology, but more and more these days are trying to make peace with evangelical churches or just with Christianity at large and kind of see themselves as just other Christians, which would not have been the case 50 or especially 100 years ago. So it's an attempt to kind of maybe brush over the distinctives and the unique things about those churches and just see themselves as another denomination. So that's one thing that Hughes does as he traces this history of churches of Christ, is tracing it from, as he says, from a sect to a denomination that has sort of made its peace with the surrounding culture. So I've alluded to this already, but I will just say one of the tragic ironies of the American Restoration movement is that not only did the movement fail to unite all Christians, remember that was the vision of Barton Stone and Thomas Campbell, to unite all Christians by means of going back to the Bible only. Not only did it fail to unite all Christians together, but there were also divisions within this unity movement. So the main division, this is kind of just a summary here, setting up what we're going to talk about in more detail in a moment, but the main division happened officially in 1906 with the US Census. And that was a division between those who wanted to use instrumental music in worship and then those who saw no basis for it in the New Testament. They also differed on whether missionary societies were a legitimate part of New Testament church organization in cooperation. So those who prohibited instrumental worship and prohibited missionary societies mostly retained the name Church of Christ. And now we think about those as Churches of Christ a cappella, right? Then the others who retained the use of instruments and tended to favor the missionary societies were the Christian church, and often also kept the name Disciples of Christ. So out of all this, you end up with three main branches of tracing back to this original Stone Campbell movement that we can see today. We've got the Churches of Christ. These are the a cappella churches. And then the ones who used the instruments had their own split later on in the 20th century, the Christian church. And they split and are now labeled the Independent Christian Church. Sometimes they're called the 4 Cs, which is Christian church, churches of Christ, but they're distinguished because from a cappella because they use instruments in their worship. And then they split with what since then became known exclusively as the Christian church, disciples of Christ, right? So this division that we see, I think if we had to sum it up, simply reflected that tension that I've mentioned before between those two original values of the Restoration movement, the value of unity and then restoration based on Scripture and Scripture alone and a particular interpretation of it. So churches of Christ, on the more conservative view, tended to sacrifice unity for a particular interpretation of Scripture. Disciples tended to sacrifice agreement on Scripture for the sake of unity. And so they, the disciples of Christ, have been more inclined to practice open fellowship of all denominations, regardless of doctrinal beliefs. So let me just get into the weeds a little more here about a couple of those main controversies. Two, I would say, if I have to sum up the divisive issues, there are two of them in that second half of the 19th century that led to these divisions. I've already mentioned them. The first one really bubbled up in the 1850s and 60s. Again, there are antecedents to all of this, but it's the missionary society controversy. I note that most people, when I talk about this today, don't understand what this is about initially. But the missionary society would become one of the big issues, as I say, in the latter half of the 19th century. And the question here really is whether there should be an ecclesiastical structure larger than the local congregation. All right. So Alexander Campbell first opposed the missionary society back in the 1820s when he was editing his journal, The Christian Baptist. He wrote against the missionary society and other organizations like this that kind of went above just the local congregation, right? But then later on, when a missionary society asked him to be its president, he accepted, all right? So you might see this as inconsistent, and his own contemporaries were not slow in pointing this out as well. So in 1842, already he had published that year several articles in the Millennial Harbinger on what he called the nature of the Christian organization, and then ended up in those articles approving of the missionary society. Now, Walter Scott, his very effective evangelist from the 1820s, disapproved of this change, saying that elders and deacons are the only biblical organization for the church. Indeed, he said, "Who made Brother Campbell an organizer over us?" That's what Walter Scott said. A little more to the point, another Campbellite, if we may say, Jacob Kreth Jr., addressed Alexander Campbell in these words: "If you were right in the Christian Baptist, you are wrong now. If you are right now, you were wrong then," end quote. And this is sort of a response to Alexander Campbell, who said, "No, I was just evolving, but I'm mainly being consistent here." And there were others saying, "No, you're completely inconsistent with what you said earlier. You should accept that fact." Tolbert Fanning, who was one of these next generation leaders, a contemporary of Campbell, but later in Nashville, editor later of the Gospel Advocate, wrote against missionary societies. So you had very influential people within the Restoration movement who, even though Campbell went in favor of missionary societies, they remained opposed to them. There were others, in fact, who started out as for missionary societies and then later opposed them. They changed in the opposite direction from Campbell. Benjamin Franklin not the founding father of the Republic, but one of the early leaders in the Restoration movement, was one of those who made the change the other way. So it was just it was a hot controversy during those decades. The other controversy that I've already mentioned is the instrumental music controversy, which really bubbled over in the 1870s and 80s, again with antecedents before it. And this is one of those controversies that people tend to kind of understand a little more easily when we think about it today. So just by way of background, like Reformed churches during the Reformation and the post-Reformation periods, Stone Campbell movement churches from the beginning were all a cappella through the first half of the 19th century. So none of them used instruments in the worship assemblies. And it was not much of a debate at all before the 1840s. But Alexander Campbell came out as opposed to instrumental music when it started becoming more of an issue in the 1840s and 1850s. In 1864, just a couple of years before Campbell died, the question was raised again in the Millennial Harbinger. And at that time, the editor was his son-in-law, W.K. Pendleton. And in that, with regard to that issue, Pendleton wrote in the Millennial Harbinger, admitting that it's not found in the New Testament, that is, you can't find approval for instrumental music in the New Testament, but they could be used as a matter of expediency. In other words, we're commanded to sing, but instruments help us in our worship and song. Well, this controversy especially erupted after Campbell's death in 1866. Churches in the northern United States were more likely to introduce instruments than southern churches were. So you begin to see, not exclusively, but a pretty general divide between North and South on this. Churches in the South generally opposed instrumental music for theological reasons. So I want to emphasize that. But at the same time, say that the social reasons cannot be overlooked either. Think about the time period here. The South had just been devastated by the Civil War up through 1865, and then followed by more than a decade of Reconstruction, which sometimes is called the Second Civil War. And the South was already and now completely impoverished. So you kind of in the South are wondering where your next meal is going to come from, and then you look north of the Mason-Dixon line and see churches in your own fellowship who are spending bukus of money putting in what was seen at the time as elaborate and unnecessary organs into their new church buildings. This looked like items of luxury, while their brothers and sisters in the South were literally starving and living in poverty. So you can see how that might not have gone over too well. So I don't want to say that's the whole reason, but that is certainly a factor here. But yeah, the main reasons for the opposition were biblical and hermeneutical. Some of the debate centered around scriptures such as especially Ephesians 5:19 and Colossians 3:16, almost parallel passages, which speak of singing in your hearts to God and encouraging one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. The point being there that we're authorized to sing, and so it says nothing about instruments. And therefore, instrumental music is not authorized in New Testament worship. If it were, then the apostle would have said so. A lot of this is predicated on what is sometimes called the Reformed regulative principle of interpretation. So again, it's not peculiar to churches of Christ. We see this in the Reformation period, where they said, especially when it comes to worship practices, If the New Testament is silent about it, then that silence is prohibitive. Okay. So it says nothing about instruments, therefore that's equivalent to a command not to use them. It doesn't have to say don't use them. It simply is silent about it. So we are prohibited from that in Christian worship. A lot of the debates also centered around the word psallo, which is the verb used there, often translated as make music, which in its original meaning, very in early Greek, meant to actually pluck the strings of an instrument. And so people for instruments said, hey, he's saying psallo. And then those against it said, well, no, he's saying make that music in your heart to God. And it's pretty clear, I think, that by the time of the first century, the word psallo was just sort of a synonym for sing or generally make music, which is a good translation. It doesn't necessitate instrumental music. But these were the kinds of debates people were having when it comes to what Scripture has to say about instrumental music in worship. Moses Lard, one of my favorite names from Restoration history, who actually was a thin man, Moses Lard, and J.W. McGarvey. These are prominent figures in the second half of the 19th century. Each in his own journal came out for the missionary society, but against instrumental music, which also seems to be the later Alexander Campbell's position here. So when the official divide happened, those people were kind of without a home, you might say, because it usually divided along those lines. You're either for instruments in missionary societies or you're against both, right? And it's a similar hermeneutic, actually, that leads you to those positions being consistent with one another, even though you had some leaders, as I say, who were for one and opposed to the other. At any rate, as I mentioned, the official division happened in 1906 because the U.S. Census Bureau basically was trying to document the memberships of these churches and trying to decide whether these were separate churches or not. It's already sort of, a complicated issue since there's not an official denomination anyway. These are independent congregations who enjoy a loose fellowship of Christian doctrine and practice with one another, but without much or any denominational official superstructure above the congregation. That's the issue with the missionary society. But at any rate, the U.S. government is trying to document its religious demographics and ends up listing Christian churches, disciples of Christ, all right, and churches of Christ separately. Again, a division that had been brewing for a long time became official in 1906. Again, not a neat geographical split, but churches of Christ, a cappella, were dominant in the South, and disciples who use the instrument in the North. A third issue I might mention, so we talked about missionary societies and then the instrumental music controversies. A third issue that was a little more nebulous, but still important, was the divide over, we might just say, liberal Protestant theology. It's biblical higher criticism, it's sometimes called, but just I think the label of liberal theology probably sums it up as best as any. Many disciples, so especially those who had a little more, we might say, liberal or progressive view of these other issues, began to see at least what opponents called another gospel infiltrate the movement, and especially its schools of higher learning. So that issue with liberal versus, you might say, conservative theology is something that was a debate that was going on in American society at large during this time. And later in the 20th century, this was the main cause of the split between those who accepted the instrument. And so later on, by mid-20th century, you've got a split between, as I mentioned earlier, the disciples of Christ, who were more open to the liberal Protestant theology, and then the independent Christian church, which accepted the instrumental music, but reacted in a more fundamentalist way against the liberal theology and accepted the conservative and I would say more fundamentalist um, doctrines. All right, so you've got a lot of factors leading to division here, and kind of, again, referring to Richard Hughes' book on this, he mentions 3 factors that led to that 1906 division. In other words, not the debated issues so much, which were kind of symptoms of these underlying tensions. He mentions 3. 2 of them I've already mentioned. You've got the unity versus the restoration principles or values there that came into tension with each other from the beginning. You've got the Civil War, and he points that out, North versus South, where the northern churches, by and large, abandoned that early vision of Alexander Campbell articulated in the Christian Baptists and those principles that he laid out, went more with the later Campbell, you might say. And then a third thing he mentions is the underlying tensions between the Stone movement and the Campbell movement, which I talked about last time, where you have these kind of remaining differences. But as I said last time, I don't see these as being as important as those others. The Campbell movement mostly absorbed and obscured any distinguishing characteristics of the Stone movement after they consolidated. Those features of the Stone movement that did survive were not decisive factors in these early divisions. Perhaps later divisions, Stone's maybe apocalypticism, maybe some of his premillennial tendencies we can see show up later in some Church of Christ controversies on premillennialism in the early 20th century. But these big divisions between missionary, the controversies about missionary societies and instrumental music and liberal theology, all of those don't really line up really neatly with a Stone versus Campbell perspective, right? So that gives us just sort of a general overall picture of some of the big controversies there in the latter half of the 19th century that led to the official divisions in the early and mid 20th century that get you these groups, or if I may say denominations, that we still see today, the big 3, the Churches of Christ, who mostly still remain a cappella, and then the independent Christian church, and then the Christian church disciples of Christ. So do you have any questions you wanted to talk about this time, Todd, or was that mostly clear? I don't know if that was a conversation stopper or not.
Yeah, maybe so. No, actually, a couple of questions. If I can ask maybe sort of backward looking and then maybe forward looking, one particular to think about maybe moving forward. But I mean, just thinking about the differences between, you answered especially one of the ones that I was really interested in, and that was kind of the effect of the Civil War on the movement, but given as you see that to be such a huge factor in other denominations, was it the same kind of impact? Was it the war itself, or sort of just the aftermath that really affected Churches of Christ and Christian churches, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think it's both. You know, you already have some of these divisions, just geographical divisions. There is a different spirit in many ways between the South and the North, socially and religiously. And so some of those things, I think, appear in these, in what led to these divisions. But just think about the war itself and the animosity between these 2 regions that led to war. I mean, it was complicated and it's not easily overcomable. In fact, I kind of think about it like Jews and Gentiles in the first century in the church,
Mm.
having religious fellowship with one another. It was hard. It was difficult. And we might look back with a critical eye on the first century church and say, man, why couldn't the Jews and Gentiles in the church who all confess Christ get along together better? And from another perspective, you might say, it's incredible that they got along at all, that they met together for worship, you
Mm.
know. So the fact that there was tension there just shows that they were actually trying to get together. That's the only kind of context in the first century where you would see Jews and Gentiles fellowshipping together voluntarily. So it would take a tremendous amount of charity, Christian charity, and forgiveness and reconciliation to for there not to be a remaining underlying tension there that bubbles over and exacerbates these distinctions that were already there. It would take an amazing amount for there not to be some effect, you know.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising, I guess, that the war and its aftermath, again, which built resentment, increased resentment in the South. Yeah, it would be an incredible thing if there had not been a remaining tension that bubbled over in some way. So yeah, I think it's a big factor. What I want to resist, though, is kind of this oversimplified theory that you sometimes get, which is, well, churches in the North were rich, and so they had instruments. Churches in the South were impoverished, and they didn't. And that's the only reason for this. Well, no, that's to way oversimplify the grounds for believing the way they did and the terms of the debates and
Right.
everything. It's a factor, but not the only or even primary factor in, say, rejecting or approving instruments.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I guess that was sort of a second follow up to that then, which that's very helpful. Do you have sort of social, cultural differences between the expressions of the movement, even in the South? So, um, for instance, if you go into any small town in Texas and you go to the old city square, you will find a disciples congregation fairly close to the courthouse, the governing area, and you usually find those older churches of Christ sort of on the outskirts. And so I've heard others suggest that there really is just kind of a real cultural difference, maybe class difference between the two, which maybe exacerbates these things as well. Is that consistent with what you think is going on?
Yeah, that's right. So a good question, a good observation, about what you see in these towns in the South. Um, so a couple of things here. One is um, the controversies were so heated, when these things were happening and when churches were sort of having to decide, what's it going to be? Are we going to use the instruments or not? And so you had within congregations these debates taking place. By and large, in many of these towns, it was those who favored the instruments and who also had the money to purchase these things. So in the North, again, these things were happening increasingly in the 1860s and 70s. By the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, you start seeing that attitude pervade the South. A congregation goes for an instrument, and so they bring an organ in, say, and it's those, they have the building and they have therefore the much of the wealth within the church. They purchase the instrument once it's, there in the building and maybe built with the new building, it's part of the architecture in the building. Those who are sort of without, the have-nots, you might say, are kind of kicked to the outskirts or the other side of the tracks, and just were those who maybe were more marginalized in society. The other thing, so that's one point. The other point here is that, again, going back to that kind of larger sociological point about the move from sect to denomination, that not all, but many sects that begin with this sort of countercultural, we're the saved, we're correct, and all of this, and we're against, not only other Christian believers, because we have the truth, but we're against society. We're very much countercultural, and this mindset pervades it. Well, that lasts only a little while, and then they want to, build their own universities. They want scholarly respectability. They don't want to be dismissed as, the poor, ignorant, and trashy people or whatever. So we like having the approval of others. You see that in the Restoration movement throughout the 19th century, that move. And there are people who resist this. So you've got those who resist that move toward more cultural respectability. Those who resist it tend to be more those in churches of Christ, who also resist the instrumental music, who also resist these innovations of missionary societies and other things. And they don't mind being on the outside of cultural respectability. They weren't seeking it in the first place, and they just tend to resist it in their language, in their attitudes, and everything. So I think that's part of what's going on there too, and that's part of what you see in this division, is that we've got the sect moving to sort of denominational respectability, but it's a large group within who's saying, no, if that means sacrificing our view of Scripture and our worship practices and everything, then we don't care about that. Okay, so then and Hughes traces this well. I think you've got in the 20th century, then you've got churches of Christ who have split off, or you might say were split off from the Christian church. These are the ones who kind of maintained the sectarian aspect of it. In that sense, we've been using this word. Sort of the marginalized, sort of on the outside looking in, and okay with that. And then that group, the churches of Christ in the 20th century, began to make that same movement. And so the controversies you should see in light of that. Again, you got some moving toward the cultural respectability, and then you've got others resisting it. So you've got a premillennial controversy in the 1920s and 30s. People would say, no, we don't want anything, and very apolitical. We don't want anything to do with, governments, including the U.S. government, and a resistance to that. You've got other controversies, what we call anti-institutional controversies, where they just are resisting that move toward cultural respectability and seeing ourselves as just another Christian denomination in the mainstream. And so you've got those controversies and divisions that play out in churches of Christ through the 20th century. And you've got it in, again, the Christian church, which made that split in the mid 20th century.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I want to, it's popular in mainstream churches of Christ, or even among those who have kind of left churches of Christ, to point to that sectarianism as a particularly ugly thing. And I don't want to suggest that it's not. I mean, sectarianism, it can be problematic, but on the other hand, in some ways, it has protected the church, right? I had a former professor that used to always point out, you'll never go into a Church of Christ sanctuary, we would call them auditorium, and see, for instance, an American flag. Because of that sectarianism, we're kind of able to resist the sort of invasion of the sanctuary by a particular kind of nationalism. And so I think we should reevaluate in some ways that sectarianism, be critical of it, be ready to push back against it, but also to recognize the strength that it left to our particular movement. I think that can be helpful. And we all have a tendency to push back hard against those things that we found unpalatable about the movement. And I get that. You know, like you, I've been in many different churches, some of which were more sectarian than others, and it can be very ugly. But on the other hand, you know, and I guess that's maybe one of the questions I was going to put to you is a lot of times people whose only experience has been churches of Christ, and maybe they've moved on and found somewhere else to be, um, don't recognize that sectarianism across denominational boundaries. You know, it's as if the churches of Christ were the first to really invent sectarianism, and you know, the worst there's ever been. But it's not uncommon, right? I mean, Hughes is pointing that out as well, right?
Yeah, I don't know how much Hughes would say this in his book, but definitely one thing I enjoy pointing out to people who say, "Oh, the Church of Christ, you guys think, or maybe thought recently that you're the only ones going to heaven or something." He said, I usually tell them, yeah, most churches began thinking the same way, and many of them still do think that. Um, so churches of Christ maybe just held out longer on that. I don't know, but when we think about sectarianism in those terms, that's very typical in the history of churches as they move from a sect to a denomination in that sense. Or else, what is their reason for being, and kind of separating from whatever larger church they were a part of, if it's not because they think there is salvation at stake in these issues that motivate them. So that's an important point. Yeah, what the benefit of sectarianism then is that you have true believers
Mm-hmm.
in those churches, and whatever the issue is. I mean, we really think, you know, that the sanctuary is not the place for flying the American flag. That's all. I don't know how many other churches would that would characterize,
Yeah.
but it's across the board in churches of Christ. I mean, I hesitate to say it's unique among denominations, but even Christian churches have them. So it's definitely a distinguishing characteristic, and I think also a good one. And there are, of course, other good ones as well. And once you eliminate all those, you can kind of say, well, what in fact is our reason for being? And is there anything there worth defending? Is there anything worth any doctrine or practice worth defending and continuing? So this may get into other discussions we'd want to have, but in short, you know, is there a kind of where you can, is there a place where you can defend those beliefs and practices with all the, you know, urgency and confidence that the sectarians did, but with Christian charity
Right.
and openness to learn from others, even as we would like to uh, influence and teach others? Or are we as willing and open to hear from them and learn from them as we enjoy Christian fellowship with them as true believers as well? So, yeah, I mean, I like to see the more openness in churches of Christ. I hate to see the some of those distinctives being obscured or lost or even mocked.
Yeah, yeah, and that really leads into my next question. You know, maybe we'll, because I think our probably our last session we'll talk about sort of articulating a vision, but it's sad to me in some ways the way you know, we don't have a denominational structure, so there's no kind of there's no way to enforce orthodoxy, as it were, a little orthodoxy among churches of Christ. And a lot of these things that are distinctive have been sort of shoved into the adiaphora, you know, they just don't matter category. And I wonder, you know, for us, should we jettison or, you know, reevaluate, sort of rearticulate our position, especially let's say on instrumental music? That's the easy one. to look at. And maybe it is audiophora, maybe it's not. So maybe that's not even really a question for now. Maybe we'll come back to that. But yeah, it just seems to me that it's time for us to start thinking about rearticulating, reevaluating, rather than simply jettisoning those things without any kind of reflection.
Yeah, that is a big question. Good point. I think if I can say sort of briefly here, um, it's possible to practice the right thing, but maybe for not quite the right reason. So since you specified instrumental music, it's been a theme in some ways of this session here. We take that as an example. I don't think that the old way of defending that and the hermeneutic on which it's based is persuasive to people by and large. And it's not to me personally. I don't think it's correct. I don't think that because Paul didn't happen to mention something in Colossians 3:16, Ephesians 5:19, that therefore everything he doesn't mention is strictly prohibited. It says sing, and so that necessarily outlaws any sort of instrumental music in worship. And so the question is, if we're going to retain that practice, it's going to have to be articulated and defended and grounded in something else.
Yeah,
I think. So I think you're right. It has become audiophora for most churches, an indifferent matter, a matter of preference only, and nothing more than that. Certainly, if that's what it is, and it's what it is in most churches that I interact with, they're still a cappella, but they will be as quick to tell you that it's not a matter of salvation or whatever. Great, I agree, right? But is that all? Is that all it is a matter of preference?
right.
Is there something, can we talk about maybe the category of wisdom and, what's, or better, than not? It doesn't have to be a matter of salvation. Lots of things aren't matters of salvation we could do better with, maybe. I think that's how it has to be articulated, because if that's all we have is I prefer it, well, fewer and fewer people are preferring that.
Yeah.
These days. So that train's left the station. And, if there's a generation that says this is a salvation issue and that's why we don't use instruments, then and you have true believers there, then you're going to maintain a cappella. If you have the next generation that says, well, it's easier to go a cappella and, it satisfies the 10% among us who think it's an issue, but for most of us, it's not, that won't last long. Okay.
No.
Is the next generation who's never been taught about it at all, or maybe taught that it's kind of ridiculous. They will, of course, introduce instruments, and then you've lost a practice there that may have more going for it than either older generations or the current generation bothered to articulate. It's like maybe there's more to it than just it follows this strict command of Colossians 3:16. Kind of what's the theology behind it? What does it mean? What are the implications for Christian worship when you bring an instrument, especially in a modern context like this? What do you gain? What do you lose with it? Those conversations, I think, are happening in some places, but only when people have already decided that we're bringing instruments in.
Okay.
It's not kind of on the front end and let's take some time to talk to the youth about this. So we're really missing an opportunity there, maybe with that distinctive thing and maybe with many others.
Yeah, I'm always a little nervous when I hear churches say, we're going to study X issue for the next 3 weeks, because that means we've already decided and now we're going to talk you into it.
Let's see what happens here, but we already have the rock band on order. It's arriving in 3 weeks.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you very, very much again. And we'll look forward to the next one moving forward. Thank you, sir.
All right. Thanks a lot, Todd.
Okay. See you next time.
Yep.